things get appealed or contested, the issue at hand can rise up all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and whatever the United States Supreme Court says is the law, is the law. That's going to be very important for Howie. Okay, because Howie, here's a preview, is a US Supreme Court case that set up the definition of what an investment contract is. So all around the world, when people are trying to figure out whether or not a token is a security, what they're really doing is applying the Howie test, which is a US Supreme Court case. It involved this gentleman named Howie versus the SEC, or maybe it's SEC versus Howie. And it decided, kind of once and for all, what an investment contract is. Here's a little bit of history. It's kind of strange. The US has been around for over 2 centuries now. I mean, from a government perspective, it's kind of old. But we only had national securities laws in 1933 and 1934. Securities Act of 33, the Securities Exchange Act of 34. Why? It's kind of weird. I mean, there were securities before those two laws. Back in the day, securities regulation was a state law issue. Each of the 50 states, or most of the 50 states, had their own laws regulating securities. In fact, Kansas, like where Dorothy comes from, Wizard of Oz, Kansas, which is all just fields and scarecrows, had the first securities law in the United States. The reason is that all this New York money was reaching out to Kansas and cheating all these poor farmers out of their hard-earned funds. And Kansas said, you can't do that. We're going to regulate securities. After Kansas passed out a law in 1911, think about that, 1911, which is 22 years before the federal law, many, but not all US states put in their own securities law. And there was a huge amount of disagreement between all the different states in how they regulate the law, the securities law. Now think about that with tokens. Tokens are tokens. Or an ERC-20 token is an ERC-20 token. But every country on the planet, it seems, has its own different law regulating what the heck you can do with these things. It's kind of like the United States before we had federal law. There's a lot of parallels. So when you have the system of state law, because things were inconsistently regulated, we had something called the Roaring '20s, where everyone got crazy and invested all their money in securities that had no disclosures and no information about them. That led to the stock market crash in 1929, which led to a trade war with European countries, which led to the United States stop lending money to Germany to pay off its debt from World War I. Germany's economy fell apart, the Nazis came into power, and you have World War II. So when people tell me that securities regulation is just a pain in the butt, it doesn't really matter, think about this. Stock market crashes, US goes into depression, to try to save jobs, it raises tariffs, every country in Europe does the same, you have a trade war. What was a US depression becomes a worldwide depression in the early 30s. Germany doesn't have money to pay off its debts, crashes, the Nazis take over, and you have World War II. All because of a lack of securities regulation, and that is not really an exaggeration. So, I'll kind of skip ahead here. In reaction to all this, the federal government finally put into place the 1933 Securities Act and the 1934 Securities Exchange Act. Right? Now, pause for a moment and notice how strange, it's kind of odd that the US has two laws that are the core of its regulation, not one. I mean, most every other country on the planet has one core securities law. Why does the US have two? Well, the answer is they were a little bit busy because the whole country and the world was falling apart. So they couldn't do all the law at once, they had to do it in parts. The 1933 Act, which I'm, see if I can, let's go here. I'm gonna skip ahead. The 1933 Act covers the initial sale of securities by the issuer. In other words, when a company is selling its stock or its bonds for the first time, or for example, a startup is conducting an ICO for its first time, it's covered by the 1933 Act. What happens after that, for example, what happens on exchanges, or what happens when a private shareholder sells securities to another private shareholder, or the law involving broker-dealers, which are people who facilitate sales in securities. That's all underneath the 34 Act. So the 33 Act is the initial sale or issuance of securities, and the 34 Act is everything that happens afterwards. That's why you have the Securities Act of 1933 and Securities Exchange Act, Exchange, of 1934. Now, that's a lot of text, so I'm kind of laid out for you. Some states in the US before 1933, and some countries then and now, look at securities that someone wants to sell and pass judgment about whether or not that security is a good or bad investment. Is this company good? Does it pay enough dividends? Do we like the management team? In other words, they're making a merit evaluation about a security. They're trying to decide on it on behalf of the investor whether or not it makes sense to buy that security. Thank God the US and most countries doesn't do that. The whole point of the 33 Act and the basis for US law, and really the basis in the world, for the world, is they're not trying to decide whether or not a security is a good investment, except in cases of fraud. But they're not trying to decide whether or not you should buy this thing. They're just making sure that there's enough information published by the issuer that an investor can make an intelligent and informed decision. In other words, it's a disclosure requirement, not a merit requirement. So when Elon Musk says, I'm going to start a rocket company, everyone's like, yeah, right. If he's selling his stock, the SEC doesn't judge whether or not Elon Musk can really start SpaceX. It's just making sure that Elon Musk gives enough information to the public so that the public can make up their own mind. Which is a good thing, because if the government was in charge of figuring out what stock would or wouldn't, what company was or wasn't going to work, that's communism and that doesn't work. Right? I do not trust the US government or any government to figure out what company is going to do well in 10 years. So the basis of the 33 Act is disclosure. So it covers the initial distribution, i.e. the first sale or issuance of a security, which is a defined term by the issuer, which is the company doing the first sale, to the public. And the default rule in the United States, the default rule, this is what scares everyone, is that unless there's an exception or an exemption, the requirement in the United States is that every single security being sold to anyone in the US needs to be registered with the SEC, and that includes filing something called a prospectus. Now, big public companies, Apple, IBM, Google, and I'm maybe dating myself a little. Okay, when they went public, they registered with SEC, and the SEC worked with them and fought with them to get their disclosure documents, their registration statement, and their prospectus perfectly compliant with the law. And those companies went public. They sold their shares to the public and became publicly traded companies. This is obviously a slow and expensive process, registering with SEC and filing prospectus, and then once you're a publicly traded company, the fun doesn't stop there, because under the 1934 Exchange Act, not only do you have to comply once, you have to keep on complying. You have to file quarterly statements, yearly statements, comply with certain laws, comply with a law called Sarbanes-Oxley. It's generally not something that a company wants to do until it's quite big. When making sales of securities to the public makes sense. So everyone's like, oh my gosh, we don't want to register with SEC. No, you don't. Luckily, again, thank you God, there's lots of exceptions to the registration requirement. It is like Swiss cheese. It is full of holes. And those holes are there intentionally, because the Congress and the SEC knows that 99.9% of the time, it's not appropriate to have to register every little security. There's lots of exceptions or exemptions, and we'll get into those. If you're thinking about doing an ICO or an ICO into the United States, you can raise money from private investors under certain conditions, not register with the SEC, not file prospectus, and not have to comply with all of the ongoing reporting requirements. Just the main idea, again, is you don't commit fraud, either proactively or through omission. Okay, so. I like to point this out. Remember I said that section 2A of the 33 Act is all the definitions, starting with 2A1, which is the definition of a security. There's a section of the Act no one looks at, but I think is great. It says that the SEC's mandate by emission is not just to protect investors. It's not just to protect grandma. The US Congress in 1996 added Section 2E, and it says that the commission, when it does rulemaking, shall, that means it must, it's not can, it's not may, shall consider whether the action will promote efficiency, competition, and capital formation. In other words, the SEC, by law, has a mandate where they can't just get in the way and cause problems and be annoying. Under law, when they make rules, they have to think about the US economy and the functioning of the markets and promote efficiency, competition, and capital formation. I think there's no argument that ICOs and blockchain at least have the potential to improve or facilitate efficiency, competition, and capital formation. And I actually, quite in front of a room of people with an SEC person on the stage, made that point, and I heard two golden words, which is, you're right. I was like, I knew that.